It began in a courtroom packed with tension. A black woman stood at the front, calm and composed, while a white officer sneered in disbelief. Moments earlier he had mocked her in the hallway, throwing racial slurs like daggers. He thought she was just another civilian caught in the system. But he didn't know who she really was, and that ignorance would cost him dearly. Welcome to Talecraft, where every story we tell isn't just a tale, it's a powerful reminder of truth, justice, and change. If this is your first time here, take a second, like, share, and subscribe. Would you recognize power if it wore humility? In this story you'll meet Officer Blake Harrington, decorated, respected, but deeply prejudiced. And across from him Janessa Cole, a poised woman of grace and strength, underestimated by many, yet feared by those who knew the truth. What unfolds in that courtroom isn't just a clash of authority, it's a brutal wake-up call about identity, judgment, and karma. This tale is more than sensational, it's a mirror reflecting what happens when racism meets accountability head-on. When the mask of bias is ripped off in front of a crowd, what's left is justice in its purest form, and this time, it speaks through a black woman in uniform. Why does this story matter? Because every single day individuals are judged not by their actions or credentials, but by the color of their skin. This video shines a spotlight on the dangers of assumption and the power of earned authority. It challenges us to look deeper, to pause before labeling, and to understand the gravity of institutionalized prejudice, especially in the systems meant to uphold justice. This isn't just about a single courtroom or a single cop. It's about a culture that still permits ignorance, until it meets someone unshakable, someone like Janessa Cole. She didn't just endure the insult, she flipped the script. So buckle in, because over the next few minutes, we're diving deep into a real-life encounter that stunned everyone present. The cop, the crowd, the cameras, none of them were ready. You'll see how respect can be demanded without a single raised voice, and how power doesn't always enter the room loudly, but when it does, it makes history. Stay with us to the end, because this isn't just a story, it's a lesson. Don't forget to hit that like button, share this story if it moves you, and subscribe to Talecraft for more true stories that shake the status quo. It was a quiet morning in the county courthouse. People filed into courtroom 4B, adjusting ties, clutching case files, whispering about routine hearings. Among the crowd was Officer Blake Harrington, a tall, square-jawed veteran of the force with a record of service, and a history of complaints tucked beneath it. As he entered, his eyes narrowed at a black woman seated at the attorney's table. "Who let the secretary sit there?" he scoffed to a colleague loud enough for others to hear. His words dripped with entitlement. The woman didn't flinch. She glanced up once, then calmly returned to her folder. Blake was there to testify in a minor use-of-force case, one he considered beneath him. He had no idea the woman he'd insulted would be playing any role in the proceedings. As the judge entered and everyone rose, Officer Harrington remained smug. But something shifted. The judge announced, "Today's internal review will be overseen by the newly appointed interim police chief, Janessa Cole." The room turned. The black woman stepped forward, and Blake's smirk collapsed. The air thickened. His face flushed, jaw clenched, hands twitching slightly. He couldn't believe it. The woman he mocked was his boss? "Let's proceed," Chief Cole said firmly, her voice calm but steely. Blake tried to hide his discomfort, but the arrogance that once defined him was rapidly fading. As the testimony began, Cole asked direct, pointed questions, not as an outsider but as someone who knew the streets, the job, and the people he had mistreated. Every question peeled back layers of his behavior on duty, his aggression toward minorities, his unchecked biases, his temper. For every defensive word he offered, she had a fact. The room watched in stunned silence as the power dynamics flipped before their eyes. Blake grew defensive. "With all due respect, Chief, you haven't walked in my shoes," he snapped. The courtroom tensed. Chief Cole raised an eyebrow, then opened a manila folder. "You mean these shoes?" she asked, revealing a commendation file from her own career. 12 years in patrol, 5 undercover, 2 commendations for bravery, and more arrests than Harrington ever made. The judge leaned in. Murmurs spread. Blake sank into his chair. Every attempt to reassert dominance only dug him deeper. What started as a routine hearing was unraveling into a full-blown exposure of systemic prejudice. It got worse. A courtroom clerk, previously silent, spoke up. "Chief, may I add something for the record?" Everyone turned. She shared how Blake had belittled her that very morning, calling her just another diversity hire. Cole nodded, thanked her, and added the statement to the record. Suddenly, the case wasn't just about a past incident, it was about Blake's pattern. The hearing room no longer felt like a safe haven for authority. It became a mirror. One where all the silent observers, clerks, officers, reporters, had to look at what they'd been enabling. Blake tried to pivot, playing the victim. "This feels like an ambush," he muttered. But the judge interrupted. "Officer Harrington, what you're experiencing is accountability, not an ambush." It was a moment no one forgot. Chief Cole didn't gloat, didn't raise her voice. She simply enforced justice the way it should be, without bias, without vengeance, with dignity. Her presence spoke volumes. Every line she delivered dismantled years of toxic culture, an act of quiet rebellion against a system that had ignored voices like hers for too long. The courtroom had become a place of reckoning. By the time the session ended, Officer Harrington looked like a man who had aged 10 years. His arrogance had withered, his voice faltered. Chief Cole thanked the judge, gave a respectful nod to the court staff, and walked out with grace. No celebration, just purpose. Cameras were waiting outside, reporters eager for a quote. She simply said, "Respect is not optional. It's foundational." And with that, she disappeared into her car. Inside the courthouse, whispers turned into realizations. Everyone had just witnessed something rare, not just justice served but dignity defeating discrimination in real time. The courtroom was buzzing that morning, filled with a mix of reporters, citizens, and a few local officials. On the bench sat Judge Daniels, looking every bit as tired as the century-old courtroom walls behind him. As the bailiff called the case, everyone turned to the defendant's bench. There stood the black woman, Grace Morgan, composed and regal. She wore a simple navy suit, her natural hair styled back, her badge not yet revealed. Then came the door swinging open, and in stormed Officer Mike Talbot, stomping in like he owned the place. He spotted Grace from across the room and without hesitation, walked straight toward her. "You again?" he barked loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Didn't know this court allowed liars and criminals on this side of the bars." Gasps erupted, but Grace didn't flinch. She simply turned toward him, eyes calm. Her silence screamed louder than his insults. Judge Daniels raised his gavel, stunned, but before he could speak, Talbot pushed further. "You gonna cry victim again, sweetheart?" he said, sneering with his hands on his hips. "You think flashing your little community activist title makes you better than us real officers?" The room grew tense. Grace stood still. But then something shifted. With deliberate grace, she reached into her blazer and pulled out a document, an official letter from the mayor's office, signed and sealed. She handed it to the judge without a word. Talbot scoffed. "What's that? A list of complaints? Trying to shut us down?" He chuckled, oblivious. Judge Daniels unfolded the paper, his expression changing from neutral to stunned disbelief. His mouth moved but no words came out. The entire courtroom leaned in. "Mr. Talbot," the judge finally said, voice firm, "you're addressing your new superior. This woman has just been appointed chief of police." There was a beat of silence that hit the room like a held breath. Talbot's face went blank, then turned a vivid red. He stammered, trying to speak, but nothing coherent left his mouth. The irony drenched the moment. This was the same officer who had profiled, insulted, and belittled Grace just days before. Now, in front of a packed courtroom, he stood exposed, humiliated by his own arrogance. "You've got to be kidding," he finally muttered, but no one was laughing. Grace finally spoke, her voice calm and measured. "Respect isn't given because of color or title, it's earned through conduct. And clearly you've forgotten that." Her words echoed off the walls like a gavel slamming down. Even the judge nodded in agreement. "This hearing," he said, "just turned into something much bigger than we scheduled." The crowd murmured, realizing this wasn't just a court case, it was a reckoning. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Cameras clicked. The crowd whispered. But Talbot didn't move. He stood there, frozen, his own actions collapsing onto him like bricks. "Do you deny calling her a criminal in public spaces?" the judge asked. Talbot opened his mouth but paused. "Well, I thought she was," he tried. But Grace interrupted gently. "You thought wrong. And you didn't ask. You assumed." Her words were clinical but cutting. "You judged based on skin, not facts." The judge asked Talbot to step aside. "This matter is now under review. Officer Talbot, your conduct in this courtroom will be recorded for disciplinary action. You may be suspended pending investigation." Grace stepped forward, now fully stepping into her role. "I won't tolerate corruption or racism in this department," she said, loud enough for the courtroom and the world to hear. "This is a new chapter. And it starts now." As the session concluded, people began to rise to their feet, not out of obligation but in stunned respect. What they had just witnessed was more than a legal proceeding. It was the exact moment where power dynamics shifted, where the tables turned. Grace walked out of the courtroom with quiet dignity, flanked by 2 aides from the mayor's office. Talbot sat slumped in a chair, sweat beading on his forehead, realizing the full weight of what had just happened. He had mocked a woman he assumed was powerless. Instead, he had disrespected the incoming chief of police, and done so publicly. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered. Some clapped. Some just watched in silence. But all understood that this wasn't just a win for Grace. It was a message to every room she would ever walk into. Never underestimate someone based on race, gender, or silence. Sometimes, power walks in quietly. The courtroom was eerily silent as the door creaked open. Everyone turned their heads. Walking in, dressed sharply in a dark blue tailored suit with an air of quiet authority, was the woman Officer Donnelly had shoved and humiliated just hours earlier. She walked past the benches without so much as glancing at the officer, who was now standing beside the judge with a smug look on his face. But that smugness began to fade as murmurs rippled through the room. Judge Harris adjusted his glasses, looked over his notes, and then stood. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "before we proceed with today's hearing on Officer Donnelly's conduct, it is only right that I introduce someone very important to this process." The tension in the room spiked. All eyes were fixed on the woman, who now stood directly before the judge, calm and poised. "Allow me to formally present," the judge continued, "Chief Denise Marshall, the new chief of police for the city of East Ridge." The gasp that followed was nearly deafening. Donnelly's face paled instantly. His knees trembled. The woman he had belittled and assaulted wasn't a defendant. She was his boss. Denise Marshall turned slowly toward Donnelly, her expression unreadable but calm, like a storm behind glass. The courtroom watched in stunned silence. Reporters in the back scribbled frantically. Someone even dropped their phone in shock. Donnelly's arrogance melted into sheer disbelief. "You," he stuttered, pointing, "you were just some," but he couldn't finish the sentence. "Just some what?" she asked coolly, stepping closer. "Some woman you thought you could throw around because of her skin color?" Her words were razor-sharp, cutting through the silence. "Because I didn't look like someone with a badge? With power?" Donnelly's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Judge Harris cleared his throat and nodded toward Denise. "Chief Marshall has every right to address this court," he said. She took a breath, then began, "This isn't just about me. What happened in that hallway is exactly what many black citizens in this city experience daily, but don't have a platform to expose. Today we change that. Today we begin cleaning our house, from the inside." The room was still, charged with electricity. No one expected such a moment. And for Donnelly there was no escape from it. Donnelly's attorney scrambled to recover, urging him to remain silent. But the damage was done. The viral video of the incident was now being played on the courtroom monitors, showing the full force of the officer's aggression and the composed restraint of the woman he had wronged. People gasped all over again as they witnessed the assault, but now, knowing who she really was, it hit harder. Denise didn't flinch watching it. She stood still, her eyes scanning the room to gauge every reaction. "This is the culture we must dismantle," she declared. "Officers like Donnelly do not represent true service or justice. They represent fear, prejudice, and unchecked authority." Her voice remained level, but there was no mistaking the fire behind her words. Even the judge, typically stone-faced, showed signs of personal reflection. It wasn't just about Donnelly's actions, it was about everything he symbolized. And now, that symbolism was being stripped bare in front of cameras, lawyers, and the citizens who had come seeking justice. Donnelly, unable to maintain eye contact, looked at the ground, his once proud figure reduced to a shell of guilt and shame. The courtroom had become a classroom. And the lesson was brutal. As the judge prepared to issue a suspension and internal review, Denise made a final statement, not out of anger but purpose. "Justice," she said, "isn't about revenge. It's about restoration and accountability. But make no mistake, this department will not tolerate racism, brutality, or abuse of power under my leadership." The audience, which had remained quiet out of respect, erupted in applause. Even Judge Harris, after tapping his gavel to settle the room, gave her a slight nod of admiration. Donnelly was escorted out of the courtroom, not in cuffs yet, but with his badge and gun officially revoked pending a full investigation. It was poetic, almost surreal. The very system that once protected men like him was now holding them accountable, thanks to the leadership of someone they would have never expected to rise so high. Outside the courtroom, people gathered, reporters swarmed, and Chief Denise Marshall stood tall, not as a victim but as a symbol of change. The courtroom may have closed its doors for the day, but a new chapter for the city had just begun. One where justice had a new face, and it was black, fearless, and in charge. The courtroom was never the same again. The silence that followed the shocking revelation of Chief Daniel's identity echoed louder than the confrontation itself. Everyone watched as Officer Barnes, once red with rage, now sat pale and shaken. The weight of what he had done settled on him like a storm cloud. The woman he belittled, harassed, and manhandled wasn't just a citizen seeking justice. She was now his superior. The irony stung, not just for him, but for every officer who had silently endorsed or enabled such behavior. It was a sobering wake-up call. Justice didn't just wear a badge. It wore dignity, resilience, and now the uniform of someone they had underestimated. The department's culture was about to shift. News of the incident traveled fast, sparking national headlines and widespread debate. The court released footage, and people everywhere watched with bated breath as the truth unfolded. The story struck a deep chord, not because it was rare but because it was all too familiar. This time, though, the ending was different. Instead of silence, there was accountability. Instead of burying the event, the city council held open forums. Officer Barnes was suspended, pending a full investigation. More importantly, Chief Daniel stepped up with strength and grace, not to retaliate but to reform. She publicly addressed the incident, urging unity, training, and transformation. Her message was clear: authority without respect for humanity is a danger to all. Under Chief Daniel's leadership, the department saw its first mandatory racial bias training rolled out within a month. Officers were required to attend community dialogue sessions, where they faced the people they served, and the people they'd wronged. Barnes himself, after publicly apologizing, volunteered to participate in a restorative justice program. It wasn't about saving his job. It was about owning the harm he caused and rebuilding trust brick by brick. As hard as it was, Daniels gave him a chance, not because he deserved it but because change has to start somewhere. Redemption isn't guaranteed, but neither is rejection. This was not just a personal turnaround, it became a blueprint for departments across the nation. But beyond the court, the city, and the force, this story became a symbol. It reminded everyone watching that leadership doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it walks in quietly, suffers in silence, and only later reveals its strength when it matters most. Chief Daniels didn't just take her seat at the top, she earned it in the fire. She showed that strength lies not in retaliating, but in transforming pain into purpose. And for every young black woman watching, she became a mirror of possibility. This wasn't just about justice in one courtroom. It was about rewriting the rules of respect, about ensuring that the badge doesn't shield hate, but stands for dignity and service. So, what do we take away from this powerful tale? That true power doesn't shout, it leads. That every act of prejudice, when exposed, brings us closer to the truth we often avoid. And that the future of justice rests in hands willing to break old systems and rebuild new ones. Thank you for watching this gripping episode on Talecraft. If this story moved you, inspired you, or opened your eyes, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, and subscribe to join a growing community that believes in the power of truth through storytelling. Comment below, what would you do if you were in Chief Daniel's shoes? Until next time, stay bold, stay aware, and stay human.